My dear ones, I am going to write this badly. I want you to know that before you begin reading, because I have spent my entire life writing well, writing carefully, writing with precision, writing the kind of language that sounds like it means more than it does, and I have decided that I am done with that. I am 81 years old. My hands shake when I hold a stylus for more than an hour. The light in this room is what they call adaptive now. It adjusts to my eyes without my asking, and some mornings I find it unbearable, all this quiet consideration the world offers me now, all this gentle accommodation, when I spent so many decades offering so little of it to others. So I will write badly. I will write the way I actually think, which is slowly and in circles, doubling back on things I thought I had resolved, losing the thread, finding it again somewhere unexpected. I am told you are still young enough that you will not fully understand this letter when you first read it. Your mother thought I should wait. I told her I am not certain I have the time to wait, and more than that, I am not certain I have the right to decide when you are ready. The world you are inheriting was shaped in part by my choices. You deserve to know that before you grow entirely into it. I want to tell you about the Galactic Council. About what it was, and what it became, and what I was within it. I joined the council in the year of the Threnali Accords, which you may have encountered in your schooling as a date, a number attached to a treaty, but which was for me a morning in early autumn when I wore new formal robes that were slightly too long at the hem and walked through doors so tall that I felt I was walking into the mouth of something. I was 32 years old. I was the youngest Veth representative to hold a council seat in 60 years, and I knew this because everyone told me so, and I was proud of it in the clean, uncomplicated way that young people are proud of things before they understand what pride can cost. The council chamber is, I suppose it still stands, though it is used differently now, a room designed by architects who believed that awe was a form of governance. The ceiling rose 300 meters above the floor. The walls were lined with panels that displayed, in slow rotation, the flags and emblems of every member species, though at that time the council had 22 members and the display moved with a kind of stately grandeur. The seats were arranged in a crescent around a central speaking platform, and each seat was elevated slightly above the next as you moved toward the outer edge of the crescent, so that the newest members sat lowest and the oldest sat highest. This was explained to me as tradition. I accepted it as tradition. I did not think very carefully about what the tradition expressed. My first decade on the council was, I think now, the decade in which I learned to feel comfortable. That sounds like a small thing. It was not. Comfort, in a place like the council, is a kind of politics. To feel comfortable is to feel that you belong, that the room was built for you, that the rules of order reflect your understanding of order, that the silences mean what you think they mean. I was Veth. The council had been established by the Veth, the Serali, and the Drenathai 200 years before I was born. I did not have to learn to be comfortable. I arrived already knowing the shape of the furniture. In my first decade, the great debates were about trade corridors in the outer spiral and about fishing rights in the nutrient seas of Perova V. I was on the subcommittee for resource allocation, and I was good at it. I had a sharp memory for numbers and a talent for finding the language that allowed two parties to both claim they had won. My mentor, Councillor Heveth, old Heveth, she was 90 when I met her, she smelled of a particular wood resin that I still find soothing when I encounter it, told me I had the gift. The gift, she said, was knowing how to make people feel heard without actually listening to them. She said this as a compliment. I received it as a compliment. I am still deciding, this many years later, whether it was one. The humans came in my 14th year on the council. I need you to understand what I mean when I say they came, because I am not sure the histories tell it quite the way it felt to be in the room. There had been years of preliminary negotiations, of course. Humans had achieved the kind of spaceflight that made them candidates for membership, had made contact with several species, had established enough of a presence in the mid-systems to have advocates among the existing members. The Lossoni had championed them most vocally, largely because humans had been useful trading partners, and the Lossoni have always understood that the Council reflects power in the galaxy whether it intends to or not, and having a species obligated to you before they get a seat is worth considerably more than having a species obligated to you after. But the formal entry, that was different. That was a ceremony. The chamber was full. I remember that specifically, full in a way it rarely was, because the daily business of the council was dull enough that many members sent representatives rather than attending themselves. But for an admission ceremony, everyone came. We were 22 species, and we sat in our crescent, and we watched the doors. Humans are smaller than I had expected. I do not know what I had expected. The representations I had seen varied enormously, and none of them had prepared me for the actual physical experience of being in a room with them. They are soft-looking. That is the word that came to me then, and it has never quite left. Not weak, but soft, Their faces move constantly, registering emotions with a transparency that the Veth consider quite private, and their skin, which comes in many shades, catches light differently than most of the species I had sat beside for 14 years. They move with a kind of deliberate energy, as though they are always slightly in motion even when still. The human delegation entered, 3 representatives and their staff, a total of 9 people. The head of delegation was a woman named Ilara Voss. She was perhaps 50 in human years. I have learned since how to read human age, though I was less practiced then, with grey beginning to show in her hair, which she wore pulled back, and eyes that were the colour of a mid-range nebula, a sort of brownish amber that I later learned humans call hazel. She walked to the speaking platform and gave a speech about cooperation and mutual flourishing that was, in retrospect, exactly the kind of speech you give when you are trying very hard to seem unthreatening. We welcomed them. We gave them their seat. We applauded in our various ways. The Veth tapped 2 fingers against the opposite palm. I do not know if you have been taught this, and the ceremony concluded and there was a reception in the adjoining hall where everyone mingled and the humans circulated with what I can only describe as careful friendliness, speaking to as many people as they could, asking questions, laughing when laughter seemed appropriate. I spoke to Ilara Voss for perhaps 4 minutes at that reception. I asked how she found the chamber. She said it was extraordinary. She asked if the ceiling had always been that height. I said it had, and explained the original architect's philosophy. She nodded and said something about how impressive it must be to work in such a space every day. I agreed that one did eventually become accustomed to it. We finished our drinks. I excused myself. I have thought about those 4 minutes many times. What I did not know, what none of us in the Veth delegation knew, or thought to ask, was that Ilara Voss had spent 11 years working toward that seat. That she had navigated 17 failed preliminary agreements before the one that held. That she had learned, in addition to her own languages, functional Sorali, conversational Drenathai, and enough Veth that she could read our formal texts, though she was too courteous to say so in mixed company because she did not wish to seem presumptuous. That her hair was already grey partly because she did not sleep enough, and she did not sleep enough because she spent her nights reading the historical records of every species with a council seat, trying to understand what they wanted and feared and valued so she would know how to speak to them. I found out some of this later. The rest I pieced together over years, as I came to understand what it cost to be new. But I am getting ahead of myself. The years immediately after the human admission were years of what I can only call managed condescension, though we would not have used that word. We used words like process and protocol and appropriate expectation setting. The human seat was at the low end of the crescent. This was tradition. The human delegation's proposals went through an additional review layer before reaching the full council floor. This was prudent, given their newcomer status. The human representatives were not assigned to the senior subcommittees, the ones that handled resource allocation, military readiness, boundary treaties. They were assigned to cultural exchange and new member integration, committees which sounded significant but which had, in practice, no binding authority over anything. I was on the committee that voted, in my 16th year, on the question of human voting weight. I want to tell you about this honestly, which means I have to tell you what was said in private and what was said in the official record, because they were not the same thing. In the official record, the debate concerned a technical formula for assigning voting weight based on population, economic contribution, and what the Drenathai called the stability coefficient, a measure of how long a species had maintained continuous space-capable civilization. Humans were new. Their stability coefficient was low. Their economic contribution was not yet significant. The formula, applied neutrally, produced a voting weight that was less than any existing member and substantially less than the 5 founding species. This is what the official record contains. What was said in the private sessions, the working dinners, the corridor conversations, the small meetings that were never formally convened and never formally recorded, was somewhat different. I remember a dinner, hosted by the Sorali delegation, at which perhaps 12 senior councillors gathered. The food was elaborate. The Sorali enjoy elaborate food the way they enjoy elaborate everything, as a demonstration that they have the resources to make things beautiful. I sat next to Councilor Davan of the Drenathai, who was at that time considered the wisest member of the council, the one everyone deferred to, the one whose opinions settled disputes that had otherwise hardened past resolution. Davan said, and I remember this almost exactly, because I was young enough that I still remembered things almost exactly, that the question of human voting weight was less about the formula than about the appropriate pace of integration. He said that species, like children, needed time to develop judgment before being given authority commensurate with that judgment. He said the galaxy had maintained its current balance for a reason, and that balance had a value worth protecting. I agreed. I said something to the effect that patience was a form of respect. That allowing humans time to understand how the council worked before granting them full influence was, in fact, a kindness. No one disagreed. The vote, 3 days later, gave humans a voting weight of 0.3. The Veth weight was 1.8. The Drenathai weight was 2.1. 0.3 meant that the entire human delegation could vote unanimously on any measure and be outweighed by a single dissenting Sorali councillor who happened to feel contrary that day. Ilara Voss voted in favour of the measure. I have thought about this too. I think she understood that any objection would be noted, and that noted objections from species with 0.3 voting weight had a way of making future negotiations harder. I think she was calculating what battles she could win and what battles would only cost her the ability to fight other battles later. I think she had already started to understand the room better than most of the people in it. I did not understand this at the time. I thought she agreed because she understood that patience was appropriate. Arrogance, my dears, is sometimes very difficult to distinguish from common sense, because it uses common sense's vocabulary and stands in common sense's posture, and the only way to tell them apart is usually to wait and see what they produce. Let me tell you about the warnings. In my 22nd year on the council, a new human representative joined the delegation. His name was Oren Salek. He was young, not as young as I had been when I joined, but young, with a kind of face that records everything and reveals nothing, which I eventually understood was something he had cultivated deliberately, because his natural face was apparently one that revealed too much. He had been trained as a systems analyst before entering diplomatic service, and he brought to diplomacy the habits of systems analysis. He mapped everything, traced every dependency, modeled every consequence. His first formal communication to my office arrived within 2 months of his joining the delegation. It was 40 pages long. My staff summarized it for me in a paragraph. The summary said that Representative Salek had raised concerns about the outer corridor trade agreements as they affected human shipping lanes, and requested a meeting to discuss. I scheduled the meeting for 3 months later. It was rescheduled twice, once by my office and once by his. When we finally met, he was polite in the careful way that suggested he was calibrating how much energy to invest in politeness. He walked me through the core of his 40-page analysis in 20 minutes. The short version was this. The outer corridor agreements contained a set of compounding tariff structures that, he had calculated, would within 15 years effectively price human commercial shipping out of the mid-systems. Not dramatically, not all at once, but consistently, in the way that a river changes course, not through sudden flood but through the patient erosion of the softer bank. I told him his analysis was interesting and that I would have my staff look into it. He thanked me. He left. My staff filed his analysis under the category I am too ashamed to name. I did not look into it. He sent follow-up communications. He sent them quarterly for the next 2 years, each one updating his models with new data, each one more precisely calibrated than the last, each one shorter and more direct, as though he was trying to find the length and format that would finally be read carefully. I read none of them carefully. My staff continued to file them. I want you to understand that I did not think I was being cruel. I was not, I believed, dismissing his work out of contempt. I told myself I was being practical. I had 40 other matters demanding my attention. His communications were long, his concerns were speculative, and the outer corridor agreements had been negotiated by people far more experienced than a young human analyst. I told myself that if the situation he described were truly developing, others would have noticed. Others had not noticed because others were not looking. And others were not looking because looking required caring whether it was true, and we did not particularly care, in those years, whether the things that disadvantaged humans were true. I did not formulate it that way to myself. But that is what it was. Salek's predictions, I will tell you now, were accurate to within about 8%. He had modeled the tariff compounding correctly, the market responses correctly, the timeline correctly. By the year of his 32nd follow-up communication, which I also did not read carefully, human commercial shipping in the mid-systems had contracted by 41%. Human trade representatives were appearing before the Economic Subcommittee, where they were heard politely and advised that market forces were complex and individual sector performance varied, and perhaps they should focus on developing competitive advantages in the areas where they were naturally strongest. Oren Salek eventually stopped sending communications to my office. He redirected them to the full council record, where they were technically accessible to all members and practically read by no one. He retired from the diplomatic service at the age of 53, which in human terms is not old. He died 14 years later. I did not learn his name again until it appeared in the final report. I am going to tell you about some of the others. Not all of them, I cannot tell you about all of them, because there were too many and I knew too few of them as well as I should have. But some of them. Councillor Adisa Bekele was the first human to be elevated to the senior council tier. This happened in my 31st year, after a long and I confess rather ugly debate in which the Drenathai argued, with great formality and many charts, that the elevation criteria as written did not technically require species-level voting weight to be adjusted before individual representatives could be elevated, but that the spirit of the criteria had always implied a more holistic assessment, and perhaps the Council should revisit what holistic assessment meant in this context, and perhaps this revisitation should be conducted by a subcommittee, and perhaps the subcommittee should report in 18 months. The Lossoni, who had never stopped being invested in the human's trajectory, blocked this. Bekele was elevated. He was a large man, broad across the shoulders, with a voice that was low and precise and that had a quality I can only describe as certainty, not arrogance, nothing like arrogance, but the kind of certainty that comes from knowing your subject so thoroughly that you are not afraid of being wrong because you know where the edges of your knowledge are and you stay well inside them. He sat in the senior council for 4 years. In those 4 years, he proposed 7 significant measures. 3 were tabled without a vote. 2 were voted down. 1 was substantially modified before passing, modified so substantially that its original purpose was largely dissolved. 1 passed. The one that passed was a resolution affirming that all sentient species possessed inherent dignity that should be acknowledged in formal council communications. It was essentially a statement of principle with no binding enforcement mechanism. It passed by a wide margin because it cost nothing and because no one was willing to vote on record against the inherent dignity of sentient beings. After Bekele left the council, he served 1 full term and did not seek another. He returned to Earth and spent the remainder of his working life teaching. I heard a Sorali senior councillor remark at a reception that the humans were, he supposed, making progress, given that they had managed to pass 1 resolution in 4 years. He said this fondly. He found it charming. He thought he was being generous. I laughed. I am recording that I laughed. There was a woman named Priya Chandrasekharan who served as the junior human representative during my 37th through 42nd years. She was not the delegation head. There was a succession of delegation heads during those years. Humans seemed to rotate through the position quickly. I never thought very hard about why, but she was the one who was always in the room. When the formal sessions ended, she stayed. When the working groups met for informal discussions, she was there, in the back, taking notes. When corridor conversations happened, she was in the corridor. Not intrusively, she had a quality of presence that was simultaneously attentive and unobtrusive, and I think she had worked very hard to develop this quality because it was the only way to be in every room without being asked to leave every room. She spoke to me perhaps a dozen times over those 5 years. Short conversations, always with a specific purpose, a clarifying question about procedural history, a request for my interpretation of some old Veth precedent, once a question about what Councillor Heveth had meant by a particular phrase in a speech Heveth had given before Chandrasekharan was born. She had read all of Heveth's speeches. She asked about the phrase with the careful respect of someone handling something fragile. I answered her questions. I was, I believe, pleasant. I treated her the way I would treat a competent junior diplomat from a minor member species. Which is to say, I was polite, I was helpful in small specific ways, I did not take her very seriously. In my 41st year, Chandrasekharan submitted to the full council a document that was not technically a formal communication. It was classified as a background analysis, which meant it went into the record without requiring a scheduled response, titled A Survey of Unaddressed Structural Inequities in Council Representation as They Affect Member Species with Voting Weights Below 0.5. It was 312 pages long. It contained footnotes to 682 previous communications, analyses, and council records, many of which had been filed by previous human representatives and had never received formal responses. It was, in short, a complete accounting of everything that had been ignored, organized chronologically, cross-referenced by topic, and annotated with what had happened in the galaxy in the years following each ignored communication, tracing the connection between what had been said and what had come to pass. It was impeccably sourced. It was completely accurate. It was written in the kind of language that was impossible to dismiss as emotional or partisan. It was the driest, most precise, most careful document I had read in 20 years of reading council documents. And it sat in the record for 18 months, and I read 50 pages of it, and I filed it under the category I will not name, and I moved on to other things. I have read it 3 times since the humans left. I find something new each time. Let me tell you about the cultural dismissals, because you will not find these in any official record and I want you to know that they happened. In my 28th year, the human delegation proposed a cultural exchange program, not an unprecedented idea. The council had run similar programs between other species, in which human artists, musicians, writers, and scientists would travel to member species worlds and vice versa. The proposal was detailed and thoughtful. It included specific reciprocal commitments, suggested hosting protocols, proposed a funding structure that would be equitable across species regardless of economic size. The informal response, in the private conversations where informal responses lived, was something between amusement and impatience. The Drenathai cultural attaché said, at one of the Sorali dinners, that human creative output was of course perfectly legitimate as cultural expression, but that the proposal seemed to assume a kind of equivalency of interest that was perhaps not yet warranted. He meant that he did not think other species would want to receive human artists. He said it more elegantly than that, with more words and more ceremony around the words, but that is what he meant. The VETH position, my position, at that time, because I was the senior VETH councillor and I expressed the VETH position, was that cultural exchange programs required careful consideration to ensure they served genuine mutual interest rather than becoming, as he delicately put it, a logistical burden that good manners would require everyone to tolerate. I said this in a private session. I believed it was a reasonable caution. I believed I was protecting the integrity of the exchange program concept by not diluting it with premature applications. The proposal was tabled. It was resubmitted the following cycle with modifications. It was tabled again. The third submission was modified so extensively that the original program was unrecognizable. The fourth submission passed, but with a funding level so reduced that it could support, in practice, 3 exchanges per year, and with a review clause requiring the program to demonstrate measurable cultural integration outcomes within 5 years or face dissolution. I voted for the fourth submission. I told myself I had been practical. I have thought about this a great deal since. The humans were not asking to be celebrated. They were not asking anyone to pretend that their culture was better or more sophisticated or more ancient than it was. They were asking to be in the room. They were asking for the basic acknowledgement that they had things worth knowing and people worth meeting. And we managed to make even that into a bureaucratic ordeal because we found, somewhere below consciousness, the idea of genuine curiosity about humans to be faintly ridiculous. We did not examine this. We never examined it. Unexamined assumptions do not announce themselves. They sit in the foundation of every decision and do their work quietly, and what you build on them feels solid until the day it does not. In my 44th year, 3 things happened that I now understand as the beginning of the end, though I did not understand them as such when they were happening. The first was that the human delegation submitted what they called a comprehensive representation reform proposal. It was not drafted by Chandrasekharan alone, though her work was visible in every section. It had been developed, I later learned, by essentially the entire human diplomatic apparatus over 5 years of quiet preparation. It was thorough in the way that only work done by people who expect to be refused can be thorough, anticipating every objection, answering every procedural question before it was asked, demonstrating compliance with every technical requirement, leaving no formal grounds for rejection that did not require the rejecting party to simply say out loud that they did not want to do it. The proposal asked for a voting weight adjustment to 0.8, which would still be below every founding species but above the current human weight of 0.3. It asked for representation on the Senior Economic Subcommittee. It asked for a formal review process for communications that had been filed without response, which I recognized immediately as a reference to the thousands of documents that had accumulated in the UN responded category that many of us maintained. It asked for these things in the tone of a question, not a demand. It offered, in exchange, a set of commitments around mid-system infrastructure that the Council had been trying to negotiate for a decade. The second thing that happened was that 3 of the newer species, the Irati, the Paloan, and a species called the Svethana, whose name I may be rendering imperfectly, submitted a joint letter of support for the human proposal. This was unusual. The newer species did not typically take positions on matters involving the older members. The fact that they did suggested someone had been doing groundwork, building relationships, quietly demonstrating what solidarity might look like. The third thing was that Priya Chandrasekharan requested a private meeting with me. I granted it. I am not entirely sure why, perhaps because I had seen her request meetings for years and always met her briefly and pleasantly, and there was nothing to signal that this one would be different. She came to my office. She sat in the chair across from my desk, and she was wearing the same quality of expression she always wore, that attentive and present quality that I had always found slightly difficult to look at directly, as though it required something of me. She said, "Councillor, I would like to know, directly, what your personal objection is to this proposal." Not the VETH position. My personal objection. I said something procedural. I said I had concerns about the timing and the implications for stability. She said, "Those are the official concerns. I'm asking what you personally believe would be wrong about humans having 0.8 voting weight." I have sat with this question for many years. I sat with it in the moment, while she watched me, and I discovered something uncomfortable about myself. I did not have an answer. Not a real one. I had the vocabulary of an answer. I could produce sentences about precedent and process and the measured pace of integration. But when she asked what I personally believed, when she asked me to locate the actual objection inside myself, I found something I had not expected to find. I found that I did not have an objection. I found that I had never had an objection. I had had a habit. A long habit, built from comfort and unchallenged assumption, of simply not considering humans as fully participants in the thing we were all supposedly doing together. Not considering them as fully real, in the political sense. Not maliciously. Not with intent. But not without effect. I did not say this to Chandrasekharan. I said that her proposal had merit and that I would consider my position carefully before the vote. She thanked me and left. I voted against the proposal. Not enthusiastically, not with a long speech. I voted against it because the VETH delegation had discussed it and concluded that this was not the right time, and I was a senior VETH councillor, and I had spent 44 years learning the particular shape of my own cowardice so precisely that I could move within it without noticing. The proposal failed by 3 votes. 0.3 voting weight did not mean much. 0.8 would have meant something. The margin was 3 votes. I spent years not counting my vote in that margin. Eventually I stopped not counting it. The humans spent 2 more years after this. They submitted several more proposals. They attended every session. They continued to be present and careful and professional, in the way that people are professional when they have decided that professionalism is the only armor available. And then one morning, my 47th year, autumn, the same kind of morning I had first walked through those tall doors, the human delegation did not come. Let me tell you what that looked like from inside the chamber. The session was scheduled to begin at the 9th hour. By the 9th hour, the chamber was perhaps 90% occupied. The human seats, 3 primary seats for the full delegation, arranged in their customary place on the low end of the crescent, were empty. This was unusual but not without precedent. Delegations were occasionally delayed. We waited. We made small conversations. I spoke with the Sorali representative beside me about a pending water rights matter in the outer reaches. At the 10th hour, a message arrived for the council president. She read it. She read it again. She was a Drenathai, the current president, and her facial expressions did not move in ways I could read easily, but something happened to her posture that I noticed. She called the session to order. She said, in her careful way, that the council had received communication from the human delegation advising that they were withdrawing from the session pending consultation with their home government. She said this as though it were a procedural matter. An aide brought a secondary communication. The council president read this one more slowly. She said, the human delegation has formally withdrawn from council membership pending a full governmental review of the terms and conditions of membership. They have requested that their withdrawal be treated as provisional while the review is conducted. They have provided no timetable. There was a silence in the chamber. Not an ordinary silence, meeting silences, procedural silences, the silence of a room waiting for the next speaker, but a silence of a different quality. A silence in which everyone was, I think, registering something that they did not entirely want to register. I remember looking at the empty seats. 3 seats, low in the crescent, below the Lossoni and above where the Irati Saturday. The seats were physically identical to the other seats. The same material, the same dimensions, the same gentle curve. They looked different empty. The session continued. We addressed the water rights matter and 2 other items. We were professional and procedurally correct. I spoke twice on minor points. My voice sounded normal to me, which meant it probably sounded normal. The session closed on time. I walked back to my offices and I sat at my desk and I did not do any work for the rest of that day. I am not sure what I did instead. I think I Saturday. The provisional withdrawal became permanent 11 months later. The human government concluded their review and announced that they had determined that full and productive participation in the Galactic Council was not possible under the current structural conditions, and that they were therefore exercising their rights under the membership charter to withdraw, effective upon completion of the administrative transition period. There were negotiations, of course. There are always negotiations. Delegations were sent. Counter-proposals were made. The Lossoni were frantic in their lobbying. I think they knew, better than any of us, what was actually happening, because they had watched it building for 20 years and had said so in increasingly urgent terms that the rest of us had also managed not to read carefully. The humans were polite throughout. They listened to everything. They asked clarifying questions. They thanked people for their time. They did not come back. There were other species, in the years that followed, who also left. Not all at once, not dramatically, not in a coordinated way, but over the decade following the human withdrawal, for other species reduced their participation, and 2 withdrew entirely, and the Irati, who had co-signed the letter of support for the reform proposal, made a formal statement that they were reassessing their relationship with the senior members of the council. These were not unrelated events. That is what I want you to understand. The galaxy is not so large that things happen without connection to each other. Consequences move. They travel. They arrive somewhere distant and are called, by the people who encounter them there, something new and local, but they are not new and they are not local. They are old and they came a long way to find you. I served 2 more years after the human withdrawal. It is hard to explain what those 2 years were like. The council continued to function. The sessions met. The votes were taken. The treaty language was negotiated. I attended everything. I was, by that point, the longest-serving active member, and there is a particular loneliness in long service, a loneliness that is different from ordinary loneliness because it is made not of absence but of accumulated difference, of seeing the place you are in become gradually less like the place you thought you were. I retired quietly. There was a small ceremony. There were speeches about the long view and institutional memory and the value of continuity. I shook many hands. I went home. I have spent the 14 years since my retirement reading the things I did not read when I should have read them. Oren Salek's 40 pages and his 32 follow-ups. Chandrasekharan's 312-page survey. The 612 communications that came to my office across 30 years, now retrieved from archives and read in full. I do not know why I thought this was something I owed myself. I think perhaps I owe it not to myself. The communications are extraordinary. I want to tell you this plainly. They are extraordinary documents. They are careful and specific and often brilliant and always, in some way, patient in the particular way of people who have been told by the shape of every room they enter that their concerns are not urgent, and who have decided to be patient anyway, not because they feel patience is warranted but because it is the only instrument available and they intend to use every instrument available until something works. Salek's analyses were right. The tariff projections were right. The structural inequity surveys were right. Bekele's proposals, the ones that were voted down or modified into pointlessness, were right. I have read them now in full, and they were right, and voting them down made the galaxy worse by precisely the amount he said it would make the galaxy worse, and we had his calculations the whole time. I have also read the communications I dismissed not because they were right but because the people who wrote them were trying, in the language of official diplomatic correspondence, to say something that official diplomatic correspondence is not designed to say. They were trying to say, we are here and we matter and we are watching and what happens here will not stay here and we need you to understand this before it becomes impossible to address. That is a hard thing to say in formal language. It sounds like a complaint and complaints are easy to file. It sounds like a warning and warnings are easy to defer. What it actually is harder to name. It is something between a request and a reckoning. It is people saying, before things break, here is where the breaking will happen, and here is what it will cost, and it does not have to cost this much. I deferred it. I filed it. I had my categories. Here is what the galaxy looks like now. You know this as the world you live in, which means you may not see it clearly as a change from something else, so let me try to tell you what it was and what it became. The council exists. It is smaller. The chamber still has its 300-meter ceiling and its rotating panels, but the panels display fewer emblems now and the chamber is not full on ordinary days in the way it once was. The decisions that matter most in the outer systems are made in a different body, a negotiating framework established by the humans and several other species after their withdrawal, which functions without a central chamber or a formal seat assignment protocol or a stability coefficient formula. It is messier than the council. It is also, by most measures, more effective. The Lossoni told us this would happen. They said it in meetings and they said it in private and they said it in a formal communiqué that was circulated and discussed and ultimately treated as an interesting perspective. I voted to note and file the Lossoni communiqué. I did this in my 45th year, 2 years before the humans left, when we still had time. The mid-systems that Salek mapped, the shipping routes that the tariff structures were quietly destroying, have been restructured under the new framework. They function better than they did at any point in the council period. This restructuring happened without us. We were not consulted. This was not malice on anyone's part. We were simply not at the table where it was worked out. I find I do not resent this. I resent myself for making it necessary. My dear ones, I have been trying to find the thing I most want to say to you for this entire letter, and I think I have been writing around it because it is embarrassing to say directly, and I have already said so many embarrassing things in this letter that I thought perhaps one more would not be such a weight. But here it is. I believed for most of my life that I was a reasonable person. I believed this sincerely. I was not lying to myself, or not exactly. I had the evidence for it. I was educated, I was thoughtful by the standards of my peers, I prided myself on careful analysis. I could sit in a room with people I disagreed with and find the language that allowed a workable conclusion. I was not cruel, I told myself. I was not cruel, because I could point to things I had not done. I had not shouted at humans in sessions, had not made contemptuous remarks in official records, had not voted to expel them or restrict them beyond what the existing rules allowed. I measured my decency by what I refrained from, and the list of my refrainings was long enough to feel like virtue. What I did not measure was the weight of everything I did not do. Reasonableness, I have come to understand in my old age, is not the same as justice. It can be its near-perfect imitation. It wears justice's clothing and uses justice's vocabulary and sits in justice's seat and conducts itself with justice's procedure. But at the center of it, where the thing that matters lives, it asks a different question. Justice asks, what is right? Reasonableness asks, what can I justify to people like me? I was always very good at justifying things to people like me. I had spent my whole life in rooms full of people like me, and I had learned exactly what those rooms would accept. The rooms accepted filing communications without reading them, because everyone did it and no one had died of it that we could see. The rooms accepted voting against reforms, because the reforms were premature or procedurally complicated or threatened stability, and we had been maintaining stability for 200 years and it seemed to be working. The rooms accepted the low seats and the 0.3 weights and the table proposals and the cultural exchange programs reduced to 3 visits per year, because all of these were within the technical rules, and we were rule-following people, and the rules were ours. I want you to be better than I was at asking the other question. Not what can you justify to people like you, but what is right. These questions will not always have different answers. Sometimes they align. But you must learn to tell the difference, because the moment when they diverge is almost always quiet, and the justifications are almost always available, and the cost of getting it wrong is almost always paid by someone who did not get to vote. I remember Priya Chandrasekharan asking me what I personally believed. I remember finding, when I looked for my answer, that there was no answer there, only habit. That is the thing I have spent 14 years sitting with. Not that I was evil, I was not evil, or at least I do not think I was, though I am no longer entirely confident in my ability to know, but that I was hollow in the place where an answer should have been, and I had never noticed because no one had ever asked me to look. Someone will ask you to look. There will be a moment, maybe one, maybe several, when someone stands in front of you and asks, directly, what you personally believe is right, not what is practical or traditional or what your colleagues would accept. And the answer you find in that moment will tell you something about what you have been building in yourself all the years before. I would like very much for you to find something more solid than I found in myself. The humans are out there. I mean this literally, they are living in the galaxy, trading, building, doing what species do. They are not waiting for the council to reconsider. They are not hoping to be invited back. They moved on with the particular efficiency of people who have finished waiting. I have seen, in the public records, the names of some of their newer diplomatic institutions. Chandrasekharan's name is on several founding documents. She was already old when the withdrawal happened. She must be very old now, if she is still alive. I do not know if she is still alive. I did not feel I had the standing to inquire. I would have liked to apologize to her. I have considered writing. But apology from the person who did not read your letters, delivered after you have finished waiting and built something else, has a quality of self-service that I find I cannot get past. It would be for me, not for her. She does not need it. What she needed, I had the chance to give 30 years ago. So I am writing to you instead. Not because it is easier, it is not easier, nothing about this has been easy, but because you are the ones who are going to live in the galaxy I helped make. You should know what it cost. You should know who paid. The ceiling of the council chamber is still 300 meters high. Some of the seats are still empty. The adaptive light in this room is adjusting itself again as I write, trying to be helpful, offering me its quiet and unconditional consideration. I hope you grow up to be the kind of people who offer that to everyone. Not selectively, not to the ones who have already earned your attention, not to the ones whose concerns are large enough to be impossible to ignore. To everyone. Before they have to write 600 letters. Before they have to stand in a chamber and watch their seats empty. Before the cost has been paid. That is what I have been trying to say. With all the love I have remaining, which is more than I sometimes know what to do with. Your grandfather, Davan Moor, former councillor, Galactic Council, retired, 49th cycle of the current reckoning. This story was brought to you by HSY Stories. Subscribe to our channel and be the first to experience every new story.